The OCP Critical Facilities Operations Framework. This webinar will look at the function of integration. We will have an overview of the function, have lessons learned and customer experiences to discuss, and end with some final notes to consider when working with this. The OCP Critical Facilities Operations Framework is a standardized approach to site operations. And in order for that to work, it really needs an integration or integrated approach between the site owner or customer, as it's called in the framework, and the supplier of site operations. This can of course be an in-house supplier or an outsourced, but it doesn't have to be an outsourced, but the terminology customer and supplier is used here. And site operations entails site management, which plans, drives, and orders on-site works and off-site works, and then follows up that it was delivered as requested and validates the costs for these and so forth. So plans, orders, follows up, and approves. You have the on-site services with all works performed on-site, and these are supported by the delivery functions that are shared across several sites, not only built up for each individual site or group of sites. For example, service desks and other parts. But when we work with critical facilities, regardless if this is a hospital or a telecom cluster of base stations or something else, these of course provide the functionality to enable the business processes of the organization. And the customer or the end users that rely on the critical facility will need some integration with this delivery, these services that are being delivered. The minimum three processes that are integrated would be the incidents, work orders and projects, and on-site access. There might be other processes as well, or usually there are other processes, but these three are always integrated. And as you can see in the left-hand column of the site operations, you have the integration aspects to consider. And these are the ones that we will look at in more detail in this presentation. The integration is delivering certain things. We have outputs from this function. One of them is an approved statement of work, including service level with penalties. It's also called a SOV or SOW. And it's really important to make sure that this is commonly understood between the parties involved. And therefore you have the subparts below that will be presented shortly. The other outcomes of this function is processes and site systems that are being integrated between the parties or stakeholders involved in this. So we have the SOW with SLA, and we have processes and site systems being integrated. That's the overall part, what we want to achieve. But how do we do that then? Well, that requires a transition phase. And again, it doesn't matter whether you are insourcing from an external provider and taking it on board to run it internally, or if you do it the other way around, you outsource from an internal organization to an external, or maybe you already have it being run by an external supplier and it's being exchanged for another supplier. Then you would have to transition that. Regardless of which, you will run a transition project, or you're recommended to run a transition project. And that is to ensure transparency and capture the important parts, and also minimize risks, especially if this is a live environment already up and running that is being transitioned. You are dependent to have highly skilled and experienced transition specialists. And for example, team members that already run the site, if this is a site that is up and running, they should definitely be part of this project. And if it's a new site that has just been launched and it now is being activated, if you like, the team that will operate the site should definitely be part of the project to make sure that they get this under their skin. The methodology recommended by the Open Compute project is to have a risk-based approach, and that is to identify where the highest risks are or the most critical areas are and prioritize those to make sure that these are clarified and commonly understood between the parties, and that's where the selection of delivery come in, starting with the most critical or the highest risk areas to lower or mitigate those risks or close those potential gaps. And then as the project progresses, you can handle the less critical issues. And by the end of the day, hand on heart, no transition project has ever completed 100% all things needed. They may complete everything specified in the project, but there are all these things that will be needed in the site operations after the project is done. And then it is better to have covered the most critical ones first and leave the not so time critical or high risk areas to be developed further by the site operations team. So let's look at that transition project. Here's a very high level and simplified approach, which shows that you have a contract in force, and if this is between internal departments, it should be an agreement on what the expectations are. So contract in this context should be read as what are the expectations of this critical facility or the portfolio of critical facilities that are being managed by a team. And with external parties, you will have a contract in force. You start by scoping the transition project to make sure that it's controllable and can be run in a reasonable time frame at a reasonable cost, and that it will solve the issues that needs to be solved rather than focusing on things that are not as critical as the most critical ones. You should have a steering group set up between the stakeholders of the site owner and the supplier of site operations. And when the steering group has signed off the scope, that's when you can start up the transition project with establishing all the project documentation and the PMO and quality management and communications and so forth. If you know how to run a project, you know how to set up these kind of projects as well. So it's professional project management is required, and that leads to the first step of the specific transition contents, if you like, of the project, and that is to perform discovery workshops. It's a quick way of looking at what do we have and what do we need to have, and then based on that gap analysis, identify what are the most critical or the highest risk areas that we need to really work on here, and which ones are important but less critical, and group those. So basically you run discovery workshops, and they have different formats. It could be desktop reviews of existing job descriptions and process descriptions and standard operating procedures, and it could be hands-on technical assessments of the sites in scope. What's the condition of the assets, and what's the condition of method statements and configuration procedures and so forth. Based on these discovery workshops, you set up different work streams. And this is where it ties back to the previous slide. The work streams will lead to outputs that are either part of the statement of work and its subparts or appendices, or it will be lead to integrated processes. It may be new ones that are being established or existing ones that are being refreshed, and site systems being integrated newly or refreshed. So through different work streams, you will get updates or clarifications to the statement of work and appendices and governing documents, and you will have integrated processes and procedures as well as site systems. And these are run in parallel. In this simplified slide, it looks like it's one activity, but it says execute transition work streams. So you run those in parallel with the key resources. And there is also definitions in the project for when these can be handed over, to the receiving organization, which of course is the site operations organization that will run and manage the site or sites in scope after the transition is done. So you execute the transition and you get a sign off by the steering group. When all of these work streams have been handed over and approved by the steering group, then the transition is finalized. We will now look a bit more in detail into these outputs from the two major types of outputs from the transition project. The first one is the SOW, where we would expect the asset lists to be up to date, border lists to appropriately reflect the expectations set in the SOW or the contract, if you like. You would have the organizations and stakeholders mapped out and documented and clarified, both for the daily operations, but also for escalations according to authorization matrices, as well as business continuity planning. You would also ensure that you have the terms and conditions in place. When this is internally run between different departments, the terms and conditions perhaps are a bit less between the site owner and the site management function, but don't forget that the integration includes also on-site works, and these are typically dependent on external suppliers. And those terms and conditions and border lists and so forth and stakeholders should definitely be part of this mapping as well. So looking at that, the main document here is, of course, the SOW that focuses on the services and technologies. And you should consider this to be the demand and supply between the parties and sort out who is responsible for what. The asset lists for the site supply systems that are in scope is important because they should either be created or they should be at least validated to ensure that it matches the reality and the actual assets in scope. And this ties back to, for example, the end of life as it's specified by the suppliers, by the manufacturers, but also what the condition is and the condition-based forecasting for change out of these assets, which leads to the financial management and so forth. Border lists, of course, is an important appendix to sort out, or appendices if you want to break it up depending on the different processes and systems and suppliers. But it's really important to clear this out, and the model used within the OCP framework is based on accountable, responsible, consulted and informed. And as I mentioned before, you have the organizations with roles, meeting frequencies, templates, who reports to who, when is escalations due based on the authorization levels and so forth. But here you also set up the meeting agendas and the templates for service reports and whatnot. If they're not already in place, of course, then they're just refreshed. And you have the terms and conditions as mentioned before. It could be generally accepted standard agreements in the market, or specifically negotiated terms and conditions with or without a framework agreement underlying that. And this is handled in the document management process, the terms and conditions, as well as the SOW and all these different asset lists and board lists and so forth. These things are handled in the document management process and stored in, some of them in site policies, but most of them in reference library agreements, including border lists, for example. So this is one type of key outputs of the transition. The other part is the integration of processes and site systems. And again, this of course is very dependent on what sites are integrated, what parts are outsourced, what parts are insourced, who are responsible for what. But the processes we know that needs to be integrated based on experience is the incident management that goes both ways from the end user organization to the critical facility site operations team, but also from the site operations to the end user organization. The other one is work orders and project management. Who orders work to be done on site, and who has the authority, and what are the standard procedure for that with, for example, the cost assessments or permit to work systems and so forth. What about the KPI monitoring and reporting? How do we ensure that the relevant KPIs are selected and that they actually are monitored and reported upon? And which one of these KPIs are used for the service levels and so forth? So all that needs to be sorted out. And that may set technical requirements on systems to be able to monitor them, or it may be manual processes. You have the life cycle and financial management that needs to be integrated to make sure that who is responsible for the budgeting and forecasting also is in control of this process, and it ties into the technologies used. And then who should we let in or accept to go into the site or the sites in scope? That means we need to authorize, decide on who has the right, but we also need to authenticate the individuals to make sure that they really are who they claim to be. And if they are, then they are let into the site. Added to that, you have customer-specific or site-specific processes and systems. So looking at this in detail, you have the incident management. This really needs to be handled correctly between all involved stakeholders. And this is definitely something where you need to sort out in line with the border lists for on-site works. Do you have different suppliers for different technologies, or do you have a main supplier for the technical installations? And how do you handle these with the response, reaction, criticality of these assets, and are there service levels and penalties, and how are these sorted out, and how do we make sure that this is really properly handled when we have an incident, or if we have an incident. In between these incidents, we will have work orders and projects, and the same thing there. Who has the right to order and approve site works? And what budgets will be used, or what are the costs? How will they be handled? Is it required a cost assessment each time, or do we have certain thresholds and so forth? Which stakeholders are involved in these decisions? The monitoring and reporting, as I mentioned before, they may be automated or manual, and they will require recurring reporting or online monitoring with live data being fed into this from the systems. And that, of course, requires technical integration. You have the life cycle and financial management to make sure that you optimize cost for services, but also costs for replacement of site systems and site system components, where you have the tender and selection sub-processes for demand and supply of both services and products. Then we come to the secure and access. The authorized and authentication here is very clearly something that needs to be considered. Will there only be in-house staff that has access to the sites? Any third party gaining access maybe should be escorted by an in-house resource, or can external resources gain access as long as they have been authorized and they have been authenticated so that the person's identity is confirmed? These things need to be sorted out, and those processes need to be clarified. Who has the accountability for providing authorization, and who is accountable for the authentication, and who is carries the responsibility for making sure that escorting is in place when required, if required. And then the supporting systems for these different processes should be considered and integrated where needed. In the security perspective, it could be CCTV, it could be biometric controls, or regular perimeter controls with live guards on site and so forth. Some lessons learned then. Well, the advisory experts of Chromatic, they've led transition projects for well, the past 5 years when this is recorded, and it's been in several countries. And their biggest lesson is what they were asked for, and their biggest lesson learned from these transitions is never to expect a transition project to be run for a shorter period than 4 months. And 4 months is an extremely pressed schedule, and it is for a clearly limited number of sites, perhaps only one site in one location. Because as they say, if you're forced to run it for a shorter period than that, you should also plan for a second project to sort out unresolved issues within the next 12 months. It will not be enough if you go below 4 months, and 4 months is really at the low end. And we've also collected some critical success factors during transition projects over these past few years. And the first one is that the site owner or the customer must be willing to invest in transition, because this secures a true stakeholder commitment. If the customer is not able to understand the value of transition, it is a worrying sign that they may not be so engaged and committed in the actual integration of processes between the parties, because this requires a close collaboration, naturally under full transparency under a non-disclosure agreement. And if this is kept within an organization, then this is natural. But it's really important to have this commitment with openness and transparency and commitment to make sure that the transition runs smoothly. And the transition should be planned on actual current state, not expected current state, or we thought we had this in place already. So by running the risk-based approach, you prioritize the processes and activities, and you need to be honest when you do these scoping exercises or discovery workshops. If you claim that something is better than it actually is, it will just bite you in the back later on in the project when you need to sort it out under time pressure. You should also keep weekly updates to present risks and issues and have resolution meetings for those. You should not have meetings with a shorter frequency, longer frequency than weekly, because things will pop up and you need to sort them out really quickly within the project and be able to escalate them to the steering group if needed. And you should use expert knowledge to minimize risks. A transition manager should be skilled not only in transition but also in operations, because you can be a fantastic project manager and a leader of change management, but if you don't understand the underlying technologies and the processes that goes along with it in these types of frameworks, it is very hard to drive the prioritization and push forward for the critical decisions. Whereas being the best site manager in an organization and knowing how to run the processes and knowing all the technology being installed in the different sites in scope and so forth doesn't make you a good project manager or transition manager knowing how to drive change management. It's two different skill sets, but they need to be merged into the same lead transition manager or the transition management team if you lack those kind of expert competencies. And of course, whenever possible, keep the experience and site knowledge in the handover process. So if this is a site that already is up and running in a live environment and it's going to be transitioned from one supplier to another, for example, make sure you keep the old supplier as long as possible to make sure you can leverage their experience and knowledge in the area, and also include the new site operations team in the transition project so that they get to know the site and the processes and understand the ins and outs and the rationale for some decisions, strategic decisions. It will help them in their continuous work after the transition is done. And again, point number 4, allow for time. But once you have time plan, be fierce to meeting the project deadlines. It's very rarely, I would say, benefit to drag on the transition project for a longer period than originally planned. But you should expect 1 to 3 months to make the plan and scoping and getting the steering group in place and really getting the approval of, yes, this is what we want to achieve. And then it will take you 3 to 9 months to execute. And this is up to 10 sites with a couple of megawatts and includes takeover of employees. But if we are talking maybe 100 megawatts or several countries with large and complex sites and different groups of employees, it should probably take between 1 and 2 years in total to execute this. But on the other hand, you would collect quick wins and have both quality improvements and cost reductions already long before the transition period is over. And with that, I hope you will join us for other webinars on the processes and functions of the OCP CFOPS framework. Thank you.